Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. Be inspired by the voices of visionaries, changemakers, and ordinary, extraordinary people who do what they do, all for the love of learning.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. I'm Lady Liberty, and this is episode number 116. Tonight, we have an amazing topic to explore. We are talking about a couple of different concepts. First, building community, using teamwork, and finally, utilizing nature as one of the main components to learning and education. We will also take a look at the importance and science of learning from the great outdoors to using those cues and clues as a guide to explore nature from within. We've got a lot to talk about and an amazing panel to explore these ideas with. So I'm anxious to jump right in, but first I'm going to read each of our panelists' bios. But I want to remind our audience that you can find out more about each of our guests on the show notes page located at fortheloveoflearningshow.com, and look for the show notes page for episode number 116. There you will find more information about each of our panelists, links to their projects and websites. I'd like to introduce tonight's first guest, Matt. Having grown up in the English countryside, Matt has passion for all things outdoor from a young age. When Matt was diagnosed with dyslexia at age 11, exploring and adventuring in nature was a sanctuary from school. His frustrations with the services for young people continued after school too, as he was met difficulty finding apprenticeship due to legal restrictions placed on 16 to 18-year-olds on building sites. Despite his confidence taking a knock at school, Matt never gave up and has always been an incredibly hard worker. Combining this energy with passion for outdoor education, adventuring, teamwork, he's traveled the world completing extreme fitness and endurance events, both on land and sea. Welcome to tonight's panel, Matt. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Sue. Sue founded Whittle and Spark Outdoors Adventures, a forest school that takes groups out into nature for adventures in play and learning. She combines woodcraft skills with deep understanding and respect for nature. Sue delights in working in the wilds in all weathers with groups, including individuals who have never met before, forming caring, cohesive groups. Her gift is in giving them the freedom to reinvent themselves. Sue attended her first ever forest school in Britain as a child, which was grown out of the Order of Woodcraft Chivalry. Welcome to tonight's panel, Sue. Next, I'd like to introduce Thomas. Thomas is trained with the renowned medicine tracker Tom Brown Jr. over the past 20 years. Returning regularly to the tracker school in the U.S. to continue his training, Thomas has been involved in an ancient English woodcraft art since 1992. He also trained with Indigenous people and other medicine teachers. Through extensive personal training and research, he has developed a deep understanding for the full spectrum of skills associated with earth living. He has also trained as a martial artist since the age of 8. In 1995, Thomas established Trackways, which teaches a wide range of skills from basic bushcraft courses, wild survival, tracking, nature connection and awareness, and wilderness spirit work. Thomas is passionate about getting young people involved in the outdoors and works with schools, as well as running a successful family camp in the outdoors since 2000. And welcome to tonight's show, Thomas. And finally, I'd like to introduce Katie. Katie works for Project World School, a community that encourages self-directed learning and immersion into different cultures as team. She has traveled extensively around Africa, Thailand, the US, Canada, and Peru, learning and living with Indigenous people. Prior to this, Katie studied towards a PhD in the philosophy and sociology of teen mental health, and concluding that there needs to be a fundamental shift in the environment with which we raise our children in the West. As well as rigorous academic training, Katie helped set up and run a youth club in Devon, UK, which is still thriving. She has worked in forest schools, an organic farm, and in the past has been involved in endurance events such as marathons and long-distance cycling. Katie noticed both personally and within groups of children that she spent time with in nature that being free to play outside is essential to learning, bonding, and connecting with each other and our own Indigenous wisdom. So welcome to tonight's panel, Katie. Katie, please share with us a little bit about why nature is such an integral component to building strong teams in your experience.
Well, for me, I started off academically studying, I did a PhD in the philosophy and sociology of mental health diagnosis in teenagers. And I was going to hospitals and schools and visiting homes and parents and trying to get an idea of what a diagnosis means, what a diagnosis is, and why it is that so many teenagers are unhappy. There's an epidemic of unhappy teenagers in the UK. So I was questioning this, and I was questioning this really deeply as well. I was doing, as well as studying, I was doing a lot of fitness training, but a lot of yoga and marathons. And one of the things that happened to me personally, like intertwined with my job, was that I started to find within myself running in the woods was becoming like my best thing to do of the day. And I was really enjoying this. And I realized, why am I going and doing this academic process trying to cognitively work out what this thing is when my personal therapy is just going for a run in the woods? And this, along with traveling and lots of other things that I did, led me to go part-time with my PhD and set up a youth club for children that were struggling with school. They didn't necessarily want to diagnose themselves, or they were waiting for mental health services, or they'd been in mental health services and it hadn't served them. And during this we did bushcraft, a lot of learning about foraging, survival skills. I was learning at the same time as well. And we brought some forest school experts in. Each week we brought an expert in. We would do art, yoga, lots of things with the kids, a lot of stuff to do with healthy eating. And during this process, we had amazing results. It was called The Project down in Devon. And basically something really profound happened. We'd go into the woods and we'd cook up a meal or we'd do something, and it was like they completely forgot that they had a problem, or they'd been told they had a problem. And we were all just getting along. Everyone had a role to play. And suddenly it was like, oh, this is it. This is literally it. And it was like, as that penny dropped for me, as well as doing my own personal process of foraging and doing my own stuff, I realized that I needed to walk away from the institutionalized realms of clinical psychiatry and mainstream education, because it was like, whoa, this, if kids are completely fine in nature, then what's wrong with the rest of the way that we're educating our children? And the other thing that really fascinated me as well regarding this was the idea that nature itself was teaching the children about really deep stuff like philosophy, spirituality. They'd see something die and they'd be like, oh, what's the meaning of life, you know? Like, and then you've got teenagers having really deep conversations about their own experiences that ordinarily they wouldn't have been facilitated to do in a white box classroom. So yeah, that's basically where I got to it.
Katie, can you talk a little bit about the physiological effects that nature has on a learner?
Well, Peter Gray has obviously done a lot of work into this. He's a fan of mine. It's about play, basically. It's about rewiring the brain to play. And it's also about, there's a kind of, with the creative process of thought and innovative thought, involves chaos, basically. And nature is chaotic. Nature doesn't have like desks and lines and like defined rules at every turn. Nature just is everywhere. And that is basically very similar to how the brain works. I think that Thomas might be able to answer this question better in some ways, because he's done a lot of research into theta brainwave states and ADHD, and really interesting as well. So, yeah.
Thank you for the great introduction. And for those that are watching, we invite you to check out For the Love of Learning archives for several shows that Dr. Peter Gray actually has been on, talking about the benefits of play within learning. So thank you, Katie, for that great introduction. You actually set the stage in such a beautiful way for this conversation to unfold. Before we go to Thomas, we're first going to go to Matt. So Matt, could you please tell us a little bit about your background and how, in your experience, team building works in conjunction with nature?
Oh, that's a broad question. I think for me, my background was in engineering, in particular in the service industry. So I would travel around by myself a lot and operate as an individual, often out of hours. So there wouldn't be anyone else when I would attend a site. I would be there by myself. So I guess without realizing, I did get a little bit lonely on the road. I would, for fun, go and take part in team endurance events. I think that sense of community that I got from getting stuck in and solving problems with other people is something that I perhaps missed out on as an engineer. And then after, I had a bit of a sad moment in my life and realised that it wasn't the path for me. Like Katie, like corporate business wasn't where I wanted to go. I didn't want to contribute to that world. So I decided to try and make my passion, what was making me happy, into a feasible lifestyle that would feed and house me, essentially. So using the friends that I'd met in this world of endurance racing and team building events, I managed to scratch by a little bit of a living and lived in a van for a bit and just felt so much better. It took a while for me to forget why I left the original line of work I was in. I refer to it as my previous life. So I'm sort of 2 years old technically. It took me a while to adjust, but genuinely, it's the best thing I ever did. And that sense of community has now grown and grown, and I'm part of a bigger community with more family to enjoy the outdoors with. I couldn't recommend it enough to anyone.
could you get into a little more detail as to what you mean by this community that you found? Who are this community, and how do you guys function together?
How do we function? That varies depending on how tired and how hungry we are. But hopefully we function as a cohesive unit. I would sign up to an event, perhaps in the UK, perhaps in Europe somewhere. I would turn up with the equipment that I was required to bring with me as a team player. All I could do was prepare myself. I wouldn't know who else was going to be at the event. I wouldn't know what was involved in the event. All I would get would be a start time, start date, and a kit list. So I have to rely on the other people that are turning up to prepare themselves the best they can. And that community is very much supported by the ability to communicate nowadays, social media and things. That definitely made it a lot easier. But I was never a fan of social media, so we would just turn up and meet a complete stranger, and then 15 hours later, that stranger is my friend for life. And we would probably bump into each other in a country or an airport somewhere else and recognize each other, and it's just brilliant. It's really nice to be involved with.
So I'm going to ask you just one more follow-up question before we go to Thomas. Can you share what sort of checklist of what's involved in community? You mentioned communication, trust. Anything else you'd like to add?
What's involved in the team achieving a goal? Lots. Yeah, communication is a big part of it. Communication is a huge part of it. Trust is a big part of it. But without getting too involved too quickly, the most interesting thing about it is learning to accept help from a stranger. And that's something that it took me hours and hours and hours to learn. It's easy to offer someone help. It makes you feel better. It makes you feel like you're doing something, and it takes your mind off the pain. A lot of these events are in arduous conditions, but actually realizing that what's best for the team perhaps is to let someone help you out because you're struggling at the moment. That's the hardest part, and that ultimately is where all the learning happens. Once you've accepted something that you hadn't considered previously possible to be an option. Being by myself, working alone, wherever it was in my previous life, and now in this new life, I'm not alone, and there are people to help me, which sounds weird, but it's something that I think about all the time, and that's why I do what I do, because I love it.
It doesn't sound weird. It sounds very inspiring, actually. Thank you, Matt. I'm very excited to explore the experience of community a little deeper within the show. So, Thomas, let's go to you. Go ahead and share with us a little bit about your background and how team building and nature intersect within your work.
I've been working with survival skills and training people in that for the last 22 years. And I trained with Tom Brown Jr. So the skills that I've learned, the physical skills of survival are one of the aspects of those teachings. Then there's a whole other bundle of skills that are to do with forming a very deep connection with nature. And that's accomplished through tracking, through listening to bird language, and which is an aspect of how nature reflects back to us how we are really. And then there's a whole spiritual component, which is looking at working with a range of shamanic skills that help us to really see ourselves clearly and to develop a level of stillness in ourselves so that we can sort of be a full and proper human being, really. And what led me into that was reading a book by Tom Brown Jr. And then not long after I read the first book that I found of his, I went back to the shop and bought every other book that he'd written and read all of those. And then I was going for a run. I was living in Bristol at the time, and I went for a run, and I thought, oh, I'll try out one of these skills, which was called fox walking. And I was trying it out, and after about 10 steps, I met a fox head on. And I thought, wow, there's something really happening here. And then a sort of bit of tragedy occurred, which was that my father died very suddenly. And he'd always encouraged all of us to follow our passion. And when he passed, it left me feeling that I had to just follow my passion. So I went and started training with Tom Brown. And the first thing that I felt after completing the first course that you need to do before you do any others is that I felt at home on the earth. And I came back to the UK and I looked around to see if anyone else was involved in sharing this information. And this was before the internet, and there were a handful of people in the country, mostly teaching from a perspective of an army type survival experience. And what I was receiving from the teachings in the States was a much broader spectrum of experience. And over the years, what I've sought to do is to try and understand scientifically what's happening so that it's possible to explain the shifts that occur that we can feel when we're involved in connecting with nature, and what's actually taking place, so that it's possible to put that within a scientific context and validate that experience for people. When we're talking about sort of working in teams or working together, I think that what Katie was saying about just being in a natural environment really changes things for everybody. And when you bring a schools group into a natural environment, then the constraints that are on them in a classroom environment are suddenly lifted. And the main problem that I tend to encounter with those type of shifts of bringing a schools group into a natural environment is actually the intervention of their teachers if they're not primed. So we'll teach them in a different way. We use an approach that's called coyote teaching. So we might not, we might have the materials there, but not point them out, for example, or we might come to a bush or a plant and inquire about it with the children or the young people, rather than telling them what it is. So that we might spend half an hour in front of a bush or a plant asking and answering questions about it before we say that we even know what it is. And that keeps them engaged and curious and inquiring. The minute we say, oh, look, it's a gorse bush, their interest has gone. So the longer that we take to actually name something, and the more they're having an experience of it, the better. So, there are different ways of working that we have, and just being in that environment can lift a lot of the constraints. It helps us our state can change just coming into that environment, our internal state. And what I've been looking at are more how to come into the alpha state, which is the natural state, or the state that nature's in, the resonant state of nature. And with the research that I've seen around ADHD and conditions like that, what's happening is that the young, or not necessarily the young person, they might be an adult, has suffered some kind of trauma that's not allowed them to develop that state. So their brain is operating at a slightly slower speed, and that's what the research is showing, and that's one of the reasons that they're given methylamphetamine based drugs, is because to try and speed their brain up. But it's possible to accomplish that through very simple interventions through breathing and using the eyes in a different way and synchronizing movements with that. I've developed an intervention myself that I've tested out with different people with different conditions, and it brings them into a very calm and focused state really swiftly. And one of the things that happens when you have a group of people in nature is that they can start to all operate within that same sort of field of energy or resonant sort of field. And a lot of so my teacher's teacher was an Apache Scout. And so there are a whole range of skills to do with getting a whole group of people into a state where they can communicate without using words, and where they can move through the environment without disturbing anything. And so we're working individually with people, because everybody starts in a different place, to maybe try and bring them into a state where they're able to all cohese together and kind of really work together, or sense each other's movements before they're making them, and so on. And there are lots of ways of really helping to make that happen. I'm just going to add one more thing, and that is that there are a number of survival skills that really help to reveal what's happening within a group. And this is one of the things that as a trainer you're really interested to see how people interact, and to be able to assess what's happening within a group of people. And one of the skills that I find that brings that all to the surface faster than anything else is if they all build a shelter together, especially if it's one that they're all going to stay in, because this throws up all kinds of different behaviors, and it starts to make it apparent to the people in the group, as well as anybody watching, exactly what is going on within that group, whether they're sort of freshly brought together or whether they're, they all know each other. And that's one of my favorite ways of kind of assessing what's going on within a group. It's a shared task. It's quite hard work, and certain people will just go, well, I'm not going to do any of the work. Or certain people will take charge and be the boss, and so on. And so there are lots of different roles that people will fall into. And by observing the group, you can start to sort of see what's going on really quite swiftly. Yes, I could carry on, but as Sue's joined us, maybe she could take over.
Sure, we'll jump over to Sue in just a moment, but first, you touched on a couple of things I'd like to swing back to. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the resonant state of nature and how that affects learning.
Okay, so in 1953, Otto Schumann, who was a physicist, came up with the theory that there was a natural Earth resonance. And about 10 years later, a couple of other physicists managed to prove that this was the case. And the theory is based on the idea that electromagnetic energy, i.e. lightning, from all of the thunderstorms around the planet is being released, and it's setting up a resonant frequency. And the way that was calculated by Otto Schumann was electromagnetic energy moves at the speed of light. And if you divide the speed of light by the circumference of the Earth, then you get a frequency, which is now understood by science to be 7.83 hertz, which is 7.83 electrical pulses per second. So when you match that to the different brainwave states, you end up 7.83 is just on the cusp of alpha and theta. So what science isn't prepared to accept yet, but I think they're, it may well come to them actually realizing that the thunder beings, the clouds, are setting up this resonant frequency that our, brains are then tuned into. And so when you so this frequency, the Schumann resonance, can be measured in any natural environment. You go into a city, you can't measure it there. So that means that natural frequency is not there in the city. But it's possible when you understand your own inner landscape, then you can generate that frequency in yourself wherever you are, and really quite swiftly. And what you'll find is that anything that you're really absorbed in, where time just disappears, is most probably bringing you into that alpha resonance. So it's a totally natural state that you flow in and through at all times, and the main 4 brainwave states are just that. They're natural states, but we're not really trained in how to access this part of our inner landscape, and it's like you say, it's not really common parlance within the educational system. And if the HeartMath Institute, for example, have done a lot of research into heart coherence, and their research is really interesting, and is largely focused on slow breathing, breathing in for 5 seconds and out for 5 seconds, and that can then establish a really even energy in the heart, a very even sine wave, and similarly with the alpha state. This creates a very calm and focused state. Just going into nature, you can enter this state. Looking at the fire, listening to music, there are lots of ways in which we enter an alpha state. What we need to do is just to, and one of the skills that really brings us into that place more than anything is stalking, moving really slowly. Okay, so as we start to slow down our movement to 1 second per step, so my whole theory and research has hinged on one thing that I've witnessed happening time and again, and that is that I'll teach a group to stalk, and I don't teach them straight away. I wait for them to be in the woods for 24 hours with me before I share that information, because I want them to have a comparison of how they are in their normal state and how they are when they've received that information and when they're in that experience. So that there's, and this is another aspect of Coyote teaching, is that often you're trying to create comparative experiences so that you can really know that you've learned something, because these things are extremely simple. They're not complicated. They're very simple and natural things. So it's important that you know that you've learned something. So what I witness is that at minute 6, so I'm counting people through a stalking step. So they're taking 1 minute per step, and they start to really slow down and move in nature. And at minute 6, what will happen is that the birds will come into the trees near the students and start singing around them for the first time since they've been in the woods with me. Okay, if I'm there on my own, that's going to happen. I've only had one group in 22 years of teaching where the birds came and sang around the students right at the beginning. That's only ever happened one time. And they were all training with a Native American teacher, and were all very sort of spiritually tuned in. So that's the only time that I've witnessed that. But so at minute 6, what happens is that the birds start singing, and I'm sort of going, well, why? I understand that when you're in this resonant state, then nature responds to you differently, because if your small pond, your mind, is going at a much faster rate than the larger pond, the Schumann resonance, then that's very scary for anything that lives in a natural environment. They don't understand that faster frequency, and that's what that's the main thing that scares all of the birds and animals away, is that your mind is continually churning with thoughts. You're not really present. And one of the benefits of the alpha state is that it can shut down the thinking mind. So you don't have to sit quietly in meditation. You can be moving and present with your eyes open, but you're in this state where the mind is really still. And that is then reflected back to you by the birds then starting to carry on doing what they're normally doing. And one of the things that happened is that NASA cottoned on to, they were having problems with some of their astronauts who were being sent beyond the ionosphere, because this Schumann resonance is only happening within the cavity between the ionosphere and the surface of the Earth. And they were having problems with their astronauts. And when in the 70s they started making Schumann generators, they then put them into every spaceship that they sent beyond the ionosphere to set up some sort of natural resonant frequency for human beings. So that immediately then starts to point to the fact that it's the clouds or the electromagnetic energy of the lightning that is actually establishing this brainwave state. And what is considered the normal brainwave state for Westerners is the beta state, which is much faster. It's so that the alpha range is between 8 and 12, and the beta range is from 12, up to kind of 25. And when, if you drink a cup of coffee, that will speed up your brainwave state. If you drink some wine, that'll slow it down. Yes, that'll bring you slower than an alpha state, more into a theta state. And you drink some tea, especially really good quality green tea, that will bring you into an alpha state. So we're talking about things that are linked to our diet, to things like Tai Chi and yoga bring you into an alpha state. That there are many ways to enter this, these states, but mostly we're not sort of trained in that inner landscape that we have. And with ADD and ADHD, what's happened is that within the child's development, they start off predominantly in a delta state, which is 0 to 4 electromagnetic pulses per second, which is very slow. And then they're mostly in that state until they're around 4. This is the research that I've seen seems to suggest this. And in the delta state, the growth hormone is triggered. So their brain is 95% developed at this point, at 4. And then they start to move between 4 and 8, then they're moving into the theta state, which is really governed by the imagination. And all of the children that you'll see between the ages of 4 and 8 are living in the most wonderful imaginary world. And this imaginative aspect is a core aspect of, and the theta state per se is the shamanic state. So then as adults, we consciously find a way back into that state in order to use that for some sort of shamanic aspect, or to work with spirit, or whatever it is. And we look at people like Einstein, some of our most preeminent scientists, and Einstein says things like, logic will get you from A to B and imagination will take you everywhere else. And he says, if you want your children to be really intelligent, then read them lots of fairy stories. And if you want them to be really intelligent, then read them loads of fairy stories. Because what he's saying is that, when he writes about his discoveries, he talks about a kind of visualization that he's going through. A thought experiment is what he calls it. And then eventually he says the words come, and then the mathematics, and not the other way round. So we're talking about preeminent scientists having this imaginative aspect, helping them to understand the real world. And so the whole aspect of the way that shaman are working is is using this theta state. And without sort of, again, going more deeply into the different schools of shamanism and the different ways of accessing those states through that, I just add one thing, which is my favorite study that I came across, which was a study that ran for 23 years by the CIA into remote viewing. So they ran this study because they were worried that the Russians were psychically spying on them. And remote viewing is basically that you're sitting physically somewhere, and then you're sending a different aspect of yourself, your energy body or your spirit body, off to look at a different location and come back and then express the information that you've gleaned. And they used some of the top physicists at the time and some of the top psychics to run this study for 23 years. And the conclusion that they came to was that anyone could do it. You know, and they used their operatives, and, you know, it's my favorite study in respect of, you know, actually looking at the validity of some of these other ways of connecting, you know, using the full spectrum of our inner landscape. And yet these are things that, you know, imagination is being squeezed out of education. And yet Einstein is saying, hey, you know what is the most important thing? I mean, even in sport, you know, you have people like Mike Tyson, who was trained by Gus D'Amato, and he had a whole aspect of his training that was based on sort of coming out of his body and seeing the fight from there, how it was going to turn out. Then he comes back in and it goes that way. You know, and similar stories that I've come across with Muhammad Ali and other sports people who are engaging in using their full resources to, you know, come to, you know, a world-class position in their field. So for me, all of those aspects are integral: the physical aspects, the energetic aspects, and the spiritual aspects. They're all really important for actually, you know, a whole education. And you know, when you're working with those spiritual aspects in a group, then the bonding that can happen within the group goes very deep, because we're talking about sharing, you know, inner aspects that are very personal and deep. And, you know, maybe we're able to see things about ourselves or the other people in the group really clearly. And that level of intimacy that allows and that creates, and maybe also aspects of healing that come through that, create a very powerful kind of group cohesion that's of a different order than accomplishing some task together, or maybe going through something really grueling where we're having to watch each other's backs. But, you know, when we're trying to support each other in a way that is very revealing of ourselves, and when you're holding a space like that, you have to be very transparent yourself. And what I found through my years of teaching is that the more I teach, the more I am just myself, rather than playing a role as teacher. And that becomes almost the more important teaching than, you know, the physical or the energetic or the spiritual thing that's being taught. But, you know, please, I could go on. So, you know.
Thank you so much, Thomas. You've brought up so many interesting points. You know, we did a show a couple of years ago on learning through Indigenous wisdom, teaching and practices, and we touched on many of the things you bring up here, and I think it's worth bringing up again that within our current educational system, we are so much more focused on the content or the curriculum rather than the natural rhythm of learning, the being still and just being present with nature. So thank you for that introduction. I would at this time like to jump over to Sue now. Sue, please share a little bit more about your background and explore the intersection between building, teams, learning, and nature.
Okay, and my apologies if I go over something that's already been said. That was fascinating, Thomas. My background is as a nature conservation specialist. I also teach Tai Chi, and I relate very strongly to your information about theta and alpha brainwaves. I have been working, well, I've been camping in a very strong outdoor group since I was 8, which is 42 years, and I've been leading groups and teaching young staff and looking after children out in the wilds for just over 30 years. There's so many aspects. One is the weather, that you are in a sort of survival situation. When we're out camping, we are cooking on an open fire. We don't have any indoor space. We just have our canvas, our tents. And we never used to make shelters, and I think that strong drive for making shelters that I see now in the children I take out from school groups, it's really strong after about 8 years old, and I think that was missing in my childhood and in the growing up, because we all had our own tents, so we all had our own space to retreat into and share with our friends. In the camping group I grew up with, there was a basis of a spirituality, of sleeping close to the ground, touching the ground, everything that brings. It was never very conscious by the time I joined at 8 years old. There was still quite a lot of skills to do. I was very proud of making a fire. I could always build a fire with one match, and even in the rain, no problem. And all of that gives you a sense of pride in your abilities to survive, and it's that survival in the wild with lots of other people. We go camping for 2 weeks at a time. That brings you incredibly close together. You fight with the fire, you fight with the weather, but you love it. You love the fire, you love the weather. You sit round in the evening and you let everything out singing together, and you also need a lot of physical closeness with other people. You hold each other's hands climbing up mountains. You give each other a push if you're used to cycle as well, going up hills. And you have to snuggle up round the fire to keep warm. There's a great intimacy in surviving together in the wild. And I like to not pit myself against nature. I like to live alongside nature. And that was what we always did. We keep on enjoying all of those aspects. When it rains, you need a whole different outlook on life. You sing a lot. You have to cheer each other up. You have to look after each other. One of the things I've noticed in this outdoor work is that you learn incredible social skills, like looking after the leader. If the leader looks after everybody when the fog comes down and you're up a mountain, the leader will need hugs and a cup of tea, and they will have taken a lot on their shoulders. Nature is a big thing for me. So I teach Tai Chi, I do Tai Chi, I've done that for a long time, and I've also studied nature. And I'm always looking at the little animals and the creatures around us and the plants around us and communicating with them. And that happens quite naturally with the groups I take out now. I think that was slightly lacking through my childhood, or what I saw with other children, when we were taking children out initially. But with my own organisation, with Whitland Spark, we give all the time in the world. Katie came out with me the other day, and we let the children, this was when we were beginning to learn names of the group that we put together. And we had a little boy who's incredibly keen on looking at animals. And whilst catching a grasshopper, he missed. The grasshopper escaped, and it leapt straight into the web of a giant wasp spider, which is a spider that's not originally from England, that has made itself very at home in the south. And they're not very frequent, but the drama that unfolded was incredibly exciting. The wasp spider in 2 moves swept the web over from one side and the other side, and in 2 seconds the spider was enclosed. And strangely, that's happened on 4 out of 5 of the last nature walks I've done. We've discovered a wasp spider. I was out doing a dragonfly survey the other day, and the swans in the pond just followed me. They're quite territorial swans, but they are completely relaxed with me, and I think it's that the brainwave state you're talking about. Because you're out there stalking nature, looking at nature, the swans just wanted to be alongside me. I didn't feed them, they just wanted to chat to me and follow along. And at the weekend I did a birthday party where the children, I was lucky enough to find, very unusually, a southern hawker dragonfly emerging out of its childhood skin. And they take a long time to do this, and each child was able to creep up really close. And in that time, an adult southern hawker came down and landed on my arm and then on my head, and was pretty much saying hello to the children with their first experience of meeting dragonflies. I think I might have gone off the topic of what you asked me, Lainey.
I am quite delighted to hear your stories, Sue. They are lovely. It occurs to me you work with younger children, yeah?
Yes, I work with all ages. So I work with toddlers in nursery groups. On the day camps I run, we take out 5-year-olds upwards. On the camps that I grew up with, we take children from 6.5 without their parents. And there's a great magic. This is one of the things I think is amazing in the work that we do, is these little children, and right up to teenagers, but and adults as well, everybody, we all come as individuals. And there's this amazing opportunity when you're out in nature alongside a big group of people or a small group of people to reinvent yourself. And when I have a really good group of staff, I see children trying out, and they might try out certain types of behaviour with every member of the group. They've got 2 weeks or a week to get through everybody. And we used to take children from social services. They used to send them to us when they had a bit more money. One of my best friends came from social services, and he said that after his very first camp with forest school camps, he stopped hanging out with the children on that side of the playground and discovered that the ones on that side of the playground were all right, and he would give them the time of day, and it changed his life. And yes, I've seen children try out all sorts of different types of behaviour, and we've had all sorts of special needs, and it's this combination of getting close to nature, working as a group to keep the water flowing and the food coming and keep yourselves dry and warm and deal with homesickness. And people get to reinvent themselves. They get to find out that this is not a positive behaviour, this is not a good way of getting attention, and that there are great other ways to get attention. And if you've got a strong group of staff and children who've grown up maybe in the system, and a strong group of staff who can ignore certain types of behaviour, you don't even have to deal with them. They just wash away, they disappear, and you end up with much more positive children. And children who come back to us year after year after year, you see them change from doctor-diagnosed problems. We've had one little girl who came to us with oppositional defiance disorder. I'm not sure if that's exactly what it's called. And we set very strong boundaries. She loved being with us. She said to us at the very beginning, I don't have to do anything you say. My mummy says you mustn't tell me what to do and what not to do. You can't tell me off. And we gave her the option to stay and listen to what we were saying, to keep safe, treat other people kindly, or go home with her mummy. And she opted to not have her mum called. She stayed with us. And it was a tough learning curve for her. She would destroy other people's wild art and creations that, you know, become incredibly loved. You know, their dens create all sorts of problems, because if you steal a stick from somebody's den pile, they're going to be heartbroken. They get very emotionally invested in what they're doing. We all do. And she learnt, she got better and better, and the tougher I was, the closer she stayed to me, until she became one of the little creative geniuses on the team and would start great big theatrical shows and learnt to behave in a way that made her an integral part of the group and a much, much happier child.
Thank you for sharing that story. You know, it occurs to me that one of the main questions we've been asking on this show over the last 100 episodes or so is, what actually is the purpose of education? Those that within the system generally say creating a student who is proficient in science, mathematics, language, or history. What I'm hearing from each of our panelists tonight is that there are other benefits that outdoor nature-based education offers. So could you talk a little bit more about what students actually do learn through these nature-based approaches?
Great question. I see so much learning happen, and my favourite learning is when children start their own projects and then have problems to solve, and maybe we have some tools or some knowledge that we can share with them to facilitate their road of discovery. I have taken out school groups, and quite often you have got pressures to put a programme together, maybe to meet some curriculum needs. I love to go with no programme, maybe a few ideas, and they might happen, they might not happen, but I love to follow the children's interests. I have taken a group out on a holiday club where there has been no pressure to learn anything, and when they've been just messing around digging in the leaf litter, one of them came up with a little cocoon, a little moth chrysalis, and they wanted to know about it. We were just about to leave, we'd been playing, we were leaving, going to walk on, and the whole group of about 20 children sat down in a circle so that they could pass around this little chrysalis and very, very gently touch it, hold it. And I talked to them about it while they very gently held it. And I've got lots of knowledge about butterflies, their interactions with ants, and they learnt more in 15 minutes than most adults. Most of their teachers would be able to teach them about insect interactions, about how these animals live. They got a feel of these animals as living beings, as creatures that want to stay warm and dry and safe and fed, that have feelings that can be hurt. And it was real, and I would have stopped at any point, but they kept asking questions. I had 5-year-olds, the youngest in the group, I had 5-year-olds asking in-depth scientific questions on what was a non-learning, a non-curriculum learning experience. When we're out in the woods, there's just endless opportunities to develop fundamental engineering and scientific inquiry and skills. And I feel sometimes that we're bringing up the next generation of engineers, and I hope they know engineering is an option as a career choice, because I see amazing designs and ideas come out of them, and feeding that, following their interests and feeding what they want to do is awesome. It's brilliant.
Just thank you so much, Sue. That was really lovely to hear. You know, some of your stories about working with children. There's one story that I wanted to share that happened about 16 years ago. I was with a group of mentors, and we went to Snowdonia. We took 10 young boys who were all mixed race, who'd all been expelled from schools in London, in the St Paul's area. And so the 10 of us mentors arrived in Snowdonia, and when we arrived, I realized that there were 10 agendas. So I immediately thought, well, make it 9. And I just said to the boys, this is my skill set. If you're interested, come and find me, and we'll do some stuff. And about halfway through this week, 2 boys came up to me and they said, "We want to go into the woods and kill something." And I said, "Great, come on then, let's go. You'll need a stick rather than a stone, because if you throw that, it's got a bigger surface area." And we went off into the woods. And after about 20 minutes, I said to them, "Have you seen anything?" And they said, "No, we haven't seen anything." And so I said, oh, yeah, I should have shown you how to move a bit more skillfully. And so I taught them how to stalk. And then we carried on for another 20 minutes through the woods, then moving really silently and slowly. And after about another 20 minutes, I said, "Oh, have you seen anything?" And they said, no, we haven't seen anything. And I said, "Oh, maybe you're just too busy in your mind. Maybe, oh, this is a nice spot. Sit here," and I basically taught them to meditate. And so we'd gone from, we want to go into the woods and kill something, to them sitting beautifully, quietly meditating. And as we came out of the woods, the sun was setting, and one of them looked over at the sunset and said, "Oh, isn't that beautiful?" And what the story illustrates a number of things, but one of the things that I think it illustrates more than anything is the nature of those skills of stalking, and how in order for them to have got anywhere close to any animals, if they actually did want to kill them, those are the skills, that's the skill set that they would have needed. And they needed to come into a state of oneness and connection with nature for that to be accomplished. And it's as if that skill set in particular has got a really bad press. You say the word stalking and you're in trouble, basically. And yet those skills are the road to a real experience of oneness, of really connecting with nature in a deep way. And so for my part, I'm really interested in that kind of energy that young people have, and taking that energy and then tempering it. And when you temper a blade, you're actually softening it. So you harden it first, and then you temper it, and tempering is softening the back of the blade so that it won't snap. And so if you like, the nature connection skills, the stalking, those kind of aspects are about softening a person so that they can find that depth of connection, with nature. And what I've witnessed with people who have kind of extreme or serious symptoms is that they're struggling to make a connection with themselves. And if they can make a connection with nature, maybe with a tree, then it's possible for them to consider that they can make a connection with somebody else. And if in the process of them making a connection with that tree, they're discovering something beyond themselves, then they're already well on the road to sort of reintegrating their whole experience as a human being. It becomes ultimately a conversation with nature, that we're trying to invite these young people to be able to have. And that's really then becomes a conversation with life.
Animals behaving normally when you're in an alpha theta brainwave state. And I think they're actually attracted to that state. I think they come closer. I've done Tai Chi out in the woods and sat and meditated and opened my eyes and had a deer looking into my face, come really close. And I've had dragonflies like the southern hawker come and land on me. Well, that's common, that's their behavior, but I've had other dragonflies and animals come and land on me or sit on me. I spent ages trying to get a photo of a little bee coming out of its hole, a little mining bee. We have a lot of native mining bees in Britain that dig in the ground. And she was coming up, and I wanted to take a photo of her, and I could see her eyes looking out of the hole. And I had my camera a few inches from her face, and she wouldn't come out, so I started talking to her. And when I started talking to her and saying gentle things, she suddenly came up, behaved completely as normal, and then she walked onto my finger. And I lifted her up into the sunshine to warm her wings up so she could fly. I think they're attracted to that state.
Yes, I think you're right. I think that it's akin to the state that they're in. So, and you know what happens is that first of all, it's like the birds. Well, it's like you're playing this wonderful game of hide and seek with the animals, and you didn't really realize that you were playing. And when you kind of get the idea and you start to become a bit stiller and more present in nature, then those interactions just commence, and the birds are the kind of first line of that, and then all of the other animals are listening to what the birds are saying, and this was something that the Apache scouts understood, and so that, you know, they could tell 2 miles away if somebody was coming, and you can tell within a woodland you've got maybe 2 minutes from the birds' interaction. And then how the birds behave around new people, you know, or somebody coming into the woods, you know, again, gives you a great deal of information about those people, because the nature reflects you back to yourself. And the whole things like equine assisted therapy is about finding this, you know, magnificent aspect of nature to reflect you back to yourself in a way that you can't really ignore, whereas you could quite easily ignore the birds and, you know, all of the animals who aren't there because you've scared them away, you know. So I was doing some research earlier this year into a book that I'm writing, and one of the things that I came across, I was thinking, well, hang on, in the Bible there are accounts of very wise people, and couldn't Solomon talk to the animals? And so I then started to research into Solomon, and it says in the Quran that Solomon and his people understood the language of birds, which I think is just a wonderful thing to have found. And in the Bible it says that he spoke about the hyssop and the cedars of Lebanon, which basically, in my current thinking, makes him one of the first recorded naturalists. But when the academics get hold of this information, then their first interpretation that I found of this notion of Solomon and his people understanding the language of birds was that Solomon must have known hieroglyphics, because there are lots of birds in the hieroglyphics. And then the other thing that I found, which made me laugh a great deal, was that he must have had carrier pigeons. And this is, you know, and then this wonderful study was released just at the end of last year by an environmental biologist called Spottiswoode, when she'd studied honey guides and how they communicate with tribespeople in Africa. And the honey guides turn up and signal to the tribespeople for them to follow them. They show them where the hives are. The tribespeople knock down the hives and take the honey and leave the wax for the honey guides, and vice versa. The tribespeople whistle this particular call, the honey guides come, and so on. And she ran a scientific study to show unequivocally that there is this communication between humans and birds. And, you know, my research is to try and find these historical aspects of how that is being, you know, documented, as much as expressing that understanding of how we have that interaction, you know, when we go into the woods ourselves. Anyway, over to you, Matt. Did you have a story to share?
Yeah, it's been really interesting to listen to everyone's experience, and I just, in the interest of balance, offer up a different way that I enjoyed being out and about by myself. I mean, I remember the first time I went out camping by myself, and that was an incredible experience. And it did take me a long time, like you say, those 6 minutes or 6 hours to really slow down and get a feel for everything. If I could bottle those lessons and deliver them to other people, then I'd be a happy guy. But what we haven't touched on, I don't think, is moving quickly. I get a real rush out of running, but I'm not, okay, I'm panting, I'm out of breath, I'm probably sweating, but on the inside, I am calm, I am relaxed, I am paying attention to what's in front of me. It might not be in front of me for long, depending how fast I'm running. Hopefully it's coming really quickly past me, but I can take in, I can still hear the birds moving as I'm coming through the forest or heading up the hills, and I can see ghosts running around or whatever. I think it's something that I would really like to encourage in kids to yes, get out there, yes, relax, listen to what's going on around inside and outside of your own head, but ultimately move, be more active, get the blood flowing around your body, eat healthily so you can do this. And for me, it helps me calm down quicker. If I'm out and about, if I've had I say stressful, it's not stressful, but if I've had a busy week head-wise, then going for a run is my go-to thing. Like Kate said earlier, in the woods is brilliant. Hills, fresh air, wind, rain, everything moving underneath me. I'm passionate about it, and that's why I love it. And if I can instill that kind of passion by asking people questions, why are you feeling tired? Why are you feeling anxious? Where's all this pent-up energy and aggression come from? Maybe making people do press-ups until they pass out isn't the answer. Maybe making them run quickly up in a mountain isn't the answer. But getting people to ask that question, well, actually, I'm not sleeping at the minute, or I'm not paying attention in class, or I'm not listening to other people. Why not? Why have you got all this energy? Where's it from? What are you going to channel that energy into? And moving quickly is something that all kids love to do, but in that chaotic manner, in a confined space, if we can just let them go off by themselves and they can have a micro experience of spending a night by yourself in the wild, wherever that may be, but just in a few short hours, if we can cut the strings and say, you know what, I'm pretty sure you'll find your own way back. Just run away and hide, play, build a den and run back. And when you come back, I want you to be really, really tired. So tired that you can't wait to cook food, and then we'll think about doing other things. For me, that's my go-to place, and maybe just because I like to punish myself. But yeah, I love the physical side, and I think there's a lot to be learned, and I really hope over the coming years, I can learn more about it and condense it and help other people learn from it as well.
My screen's... Oh, hello. Yeah, I feel like what we've all been talking about is we started opening this with like teamwork and nature and with the view for education and children. And something that's really interesting is that it's actually about teamwork with the whole of nature, obviously. And we are just like, even as a group of people that maybe have never met each other, that are coming as a cohesive unit, but we as that unit are a team with nature. And that seems to be really important in the conversations that we're having. And it brings me back to my time, like Matt, you were saying like, oh, you're 2 years old. I think I'm like three or 4 years old now. But I basically, I kind of woke up to all this a few years ago. And before that, I was working in education, trying to work out what it was before the penny dropped. And basically, we were doing this. I was an assistant for this thing, which it was part of my work, because as a PhD student, you get basically put as a kind of dog's body on other people's projects to like collect data and stuff as extra. Anyway, this was another research project, and it was called TPOT, which is the Teacher Pupil Observation Tool. And I went into the school, and you get given this like checklist, and you've got to basically put a tick box when a teacher's given a direct command or an indirect command, and then you put another tick box whether the child has responded appropriately and then, or whether they've not responded appropriately to whether it's a direct or an indirect command. And you basically have to have a stopwatch, and you time every 30 seconds you start a new page so that you can see how many direct or indirect commands the teacher gave, and you only do it for 6 minutes. And basically this was, I could not believe how many commands the teachers were giving the children within, like, you've got like 30 or 40 commands being given per minute. And they're not, the teacher often doesn't even wait for a response from the child. And I can see that, like, within that, there's like a dominator culture, and it's like not respecting nature, which is that child, and the teachers not respecting that their own relation with that child. And there's just a massive disconnect, because it becomes about obedience and about following orders, as opposed to actually having an open conversation with what you're doing with yourself and with the teacher and with your other friends. And something that's it's just, I've been evolving myself throughout working, and I've been doing things like bringing veg boxes into psychiatry wards for kids, and just seeing how that is so simple and yet at the same time so profound, because they're getting that connection back to nature, back to the Schumann resonance, back to all the things we've been talking about, and opening their curiosity. And where am I going with this is yeah, I think that basically teamwork is to do with being in nature and evolving with nature. And I've worked with children a lot in these different contexts, and nature seems to be, and no direct plan, at least none that's known by the children, is really important as well, because it means that they can completely immerse themselves in that experience. And I have done a Project Wild School Retreat, I have to get that in there, and what we do is the children have never met each other, the young people have often never met each other, and then they're immersed into basically a completely unknown environment, which is mostly what nature's also about, is immersing yourself into something which is completely fresh and new at every given moment. It's constantly changing, you have to constantly interact with it. And yeah, I just feel like, having spent so much time within the mainstream education system, there's just so much that this conversation can really help with children, and with working with helping them to get curious, get in the brainwave state that's natural, facilitate their education, and get them out into nature, and actually the nature of themselves, which, as Thomas was saying, like, you can carry around that resonance with you. So it's enabling children to be in their own resonance and that resonance then will be their natural state, which then will be more in tune with nature and more in tune with the planet. So it's really awesome what everyone's talking about. That's all I had to say.
Thank you for that, Katie. We have been going now for almost an hour. We're going to pause for a short break, and we'll be back in just a few moments.
Digging down alongside the root. piercing some holes along the side. Side, and there's sort of too much sun on this side, but that's looking really nice. Marinated rabbit, oh, rotisserie style, and then so here we have the fish prepared, wrap it up in pit, foliage and the fish. So here we are. So, how does that feel?
Fantastic. Fantastic.
We hope you enjoyed that awesome video about nature and survival skills. I'd like to quickly jump back into the conversation with you, Thomas.
It was just in response to what Matt was saying about, you know, what he was describing about being in nature in a really vigorous way. And I just wanted to share one story about that, because I think that what he's talking about is really important, especially with young people and with older people as well, because the whole thing of training, of doing something very physical, really also has an empowering and brainwave changing effect. And I had a friend when I was living in Bristol who would come round. He was very depressed. He'd come round, he'd drink my tea, he'd talk to me for hours, he'd waste a lot of my time, and by the time he went away, you know, I'd be feeling like you know, I was going to take my own life. You know, it was that bad. And so I thought, I really need to make a gesture with this friend of mine. And so I decided that every time he would come to my door, I would tell him that I was going for a run. And so he came to my door and I said, oh, Steve, how wonderful that you're here. I'm just about to go for a run. Do you want to come with me? And the first time he said, oh, no, I don't do that. And he left, and I just got on with what I was doing. It was splendid. It was a win-win strategy. Okay. And then the next time he came to my door, he said, what a coincidence, Steve. You know, here you are. I'm just about to go for a run. Do you want to come? And he said, oh, I've got some trainers somewhere. And, you know, and I said, look, we could jog back to your house. We could get your trainers. We could go for a run, you know, come on. And it took us about 2.5 hours to go to his house, which was within a quarter of a mile, him to find some trainers, to get, you know, but I was prepared to, it could have taken all day. It wouldn't have mattered as far as I was concerned. I was engaged in really a heartfelt gesture with this friend of mine. And then eventually he got ready and we went out for a run, and we went on one of my normal routes, and we got about halfway through the route, and that we came through this area where somebody had tipped out a whole load of rubbish. And I said to my friend, look, I'm sorry, I can't just run past all this rubbish. We're going to have to pick this all up. And he's an environmental activist, this guy. And so by the time we got back, the endorphins had kicked in. He was really positive and cheerful, and he was like, what, we went for a run and we did an environmental action and we came back, and, you know, how splendid. And so the next time he came to my door, I did the same thing. I said, oh, Steve, oh, that's really cool. You know, I'm just about to go running. Do you want to come? And he said, yes. And I did that a few more times until he came to my door. I said, how are you? And he said, oh, I'm really good. How are you? And I said, come in and drink some tea. And so I think that way of working to, you know, to get some, you know, get invigorated and moving in nature, it, you know, has huge healing potential. I'm not saying that you only have to move slowly at all. I've done plenty of that kind of training and find it to be a wonderful way of, you know, really waking people up as well, you know, really bringing them into their bodies. And we do lots of combination of, you know, working with balance beams and things like that, where you're using a physicality and then we're integrating the sort of meditative state to give you the capacity to move beyond what you would normally consider yourself able to do just at a physical level as well. So yeah, I just wanted to come back and say, yes, that, you know, that sounds fantastic what you're doing with those folks, you know, great.
That's made me think of something. It's the equalizing, isn't it? When we take children out into nature, when we take adults out into nature, whatever your starting point, it equalizes, and it links back to what Katie was saying about it not being about obedience, about discipline. I always thought that what we did, I was always brought up being told that what we were doing was non-disciplinarian outdoor education experience, non-disciplinarian. I now know it's not, because we have such firm bottom lines that they're invisible. And I've gone off topic. Yeah, it was the equalizing. And I've been in experiences where 8-year-olds have looked after me. So for example, if you go somewhere like caving, if you're caving or you're up a mountain, but this example is from caving, if you're coming up out of the cave, you have the child you're helping, who's less experienced than you, in front of you. So I was leading the group and I had the child I was helping in front of me, and my knee got stuck in a sort of circular hole, went in and it wouldn't come out. And this child had been with us for a week. I don't know what his camping experience was before that, but he'd been with us for most of a week. And he just kept calm, he kept in the right state of mind, he said all the things an adult would have said, and enabled me, in a slightly panicked state, to take the time to work my knee loose. If it went in, it can come out. There's no need to force it. Take all the time you've got. And it's like that the whole time. You're out there in nature, going fast, going slow, and you're working as a team, and you are all equal.
I quite like to add something to that actually, and that's, I really love what you're saying about the equality, because that really resonates with me. And obviously it just makes an obvious distinction between the traditional school system, where it's like teacher student who's got to passively learn something, and the teacher is like God basically, because they know everything, and that's the setup that it is. Whereas like when I went to I've seen it loads of times happen, like actually, for example, when working with you, we had one boy, he was much better at doing the fire than I was. And yeah, so that's just one example. Or for example, when we were in Peru doing Project World School, and 2 of the children were fluent in Spanish pretty much, and knew Spanish better than I did. And so they've all got, everyone's got different skills. Like we had one guy who was like definitely also better at cooking than me, and we had an amazing meal, and I was his sous chef. Like he was like, right, chop the veg, and I was like, okay. And you know, that to me just is a testament to how we are all equal, and age is this construct which we get given in society, where age means you know less than someone that's older than you. And to me, my experience with lots of different children is that that is totally not true, because every single person in this life has something to teach us. Every single person has like a unique gift, and yeah, you might as a teacher or as a facilitator have an ability to hold space, or have something to guide somebody that's younger than you in a certain thing, but that doesn't actually mean that you're better than them, or that you have more, or even that you have more skills than them. You just have a different set of skills in this moment in time. And yeah, I just wanted to add that, because I think that's a really important quality of moving into an alternative form of education, is really, that's respect, because it means that you're seeing that person as really truly an equal. And then any kind of obedience, or like anything that needs to be, that you need to do as a team, is then done with the basis of respect, and in which case there's no need for obedience, because you all want to get that task done, you all want to get that thing completed because it's fun, and it's what you want to do because you're learning. And yeah, I think that's really, really important, because a lot of what happens in mainstream education is obviously like the topic gets forced upon the child, and then it's not really fun anymore, and you're not even doing it as a group. So if you've got for example, you do exams, and if you collaborate, or if you speak to each other, then you're cheating, or you've got to sit still and not talk to each other. That's one of the basis of mainstream education. Like I always got in trouble. Okay, she's quite gifted, she's quite good, but she's constantly talking, and it's not like, she needs to stop doing that. Whereas actually, that was most of our learning. We actually devised a language among ourselves where we could write notes to each other that the teacher couldn't actually understand. And if I think back at it, that was actually really like the basis of us learning language and social communication. It's unfortunate that it had to be done in secret, but actually that was learning as well, I have to say. And yeah, so yeah, bringing it back, it's about facilitating socialization. This is a topic that comes up in alternative education. Oh, if your child's homeschooled, or if your child doesn't go to a mainstream school, does that mean that they're not sociable? And does that mean that they can't work as a team, that they're loners, or that kind of, that is an assumption that I possibly had. But now that I see the benefits of alternative education and education that works within nature, I can see that actually working as a team can only happen when everyone is facilitated to be themselves. Everyone is facilitated to say what their unique input is to that group. Everyone is able to talk freely and to feel that they can be themselves and say what they want, and use the language that is their language, which includes swear words, by the way, you know? So it's like, it's that kind of thing where you're just actually facilitating people to be who they are. And I feel like that what Sue said about being equal really, really rings true and is an important tenet to what we're talking about within education and within nature education specifically, because nature is equal, a tree is equal to us. And I think it's a fundamental assumption and a fundamental thing that needs to change within basically our whole society, where we understand that the teacher or the scientist or the human isn't better than the frog or the child or the, I did that in all the wrong order, but the you know what I mean. So it's like, it's basically a starting to become much more inclusive education system. Yeah, that's where I feel about that.
I think that that's really that there is an aspect of that that's really crucial, and one of the things that symbolizes that or holds the kind of meaning of that is the circle, and coming together in a circle and everyone being able to speak and being held equally is something that is used in a range of different ways. And also the what you're talking about flows out in another way, and that is that when you have a hierarchical view of yourself as being above nature, then having a conversation with nature is really difficult, because if you have a hierarchical view where you know, in a classroom the teacher feels above the students and so on, then it's not very nice for the students to have the conversation with the teacher. You don't really want to have it's quite hard to have a conversation with the teacher. And so if you're working with circles rather than a pyramidical structure, and if you can dismantle that pyramidical structure that's been culturally sort of implanted in yourself, then you can also start to really have a conversation with nature in a very different way. You start to feel that you're with your brothers and sisters, whether they happen to be trees or rocks or whatever it is, rather than you know, just feeling that way with other humans. And I think that that's a lot of the indigenous teaching is, you know, centers around that kind of and not only the sort of Native American teaching, but also if you look at the Gypsy traditions, they have a very similar way of relating not just to nature, but just to everyday objects. You know, people name their cars. There are all kinds of ways in which we have this kind of strange relationship with things that aren't human, with, you know, and with living things and so on. So, you know, there are ways in which we just do that. So it's not, I don't think it's that strange. The other thing that I wanted to just come back to is that we've been talking about the alpha state and so on, and this is one of the most useful states for learning. That the science shows us that people, when they're in an alpha state, can absorb and learn things much more readily than in any other of the states. So Sue's description of everybody's finding the cocoon and that piece of learning coming just naturally from the curiosity and the finding of something, those children would have, that information would have really gone in very deeply, and they'd have been able to hold that and most probably, you know, give it back to another adult or their teacher at a later stage because they're in that state. And the other thing, just to relate to what Katie was saying, is that there's an aspect of beginner's mind that if we're I had an experience when about 10 years in, I was invited to speak on a radio show, and they said, here's our survival expert, Thomas Shorkon, blah, blah, blah. And it went to my head. And for about 6 months, I decided that I was an expert. And what I found was that I couldn't make mistakes in front of my students, and my own learning sort of came to a halt. And I thought, this is ridiculous. This is just because I think I'm an expert. So I'm going to put that aside and just be a really good student, you know, a beginner who's just, you know, been at it for a while. something more like that. And then I found that I could make mistakes in front of my students, and that was okay. And it's from mistakes that we learn something, or it's not a mistake if we learn something from it, but if we don't do it correctly. And that's one of the things that I feel about the education system, is this whole notion of making a mistake is a real problem. And yet with life, that is pretty much the main way that we're learning. And I find out of the survival skills, the bow drill teaches that more than anything else, because we have to just pay so much attention to detail. Every part of it has to be right for us to be able to make a fire that way. And every time we make a mistake, it's not a mistake if we're extracting the learning from it. And this then becomes our journey of understanding and learning that starts to grow through our connection with nature or with other people. Yeah, so just a few more points there.
Yeah, it's super cool to listen to you guys. It's so inspirational to know that I'm sort of moving in the direction that I want to go, and accepted your own mistakes. There's nothing more circular about including yourself in the learning process as putting your hand up in front of a group of people and saying, it's not gone to plan, guys, we're going to have to rethink this one out shortly. And that pyramidal scheme, I've not heard that term before, but yeah, it fits perfectly. And again, going back to what Katie was saying about that teamwork and children being homeschooled having less social skills because they're not included in that pyramidal scheme. I was given a label of dyslexic when I was at school. So I wasn't homeschooled, but I wasn't schooled in the classroom with everybody else. I was taken out, and that definitely hindered my ability to engage in what the lesson was, because I was more concerned about why I wasn't in the room with everybody else. So even within that pyramidal scheme of teaching, with the teacher at the top and everybody in the room, being taken away from that was awful. Like, for no other reason, it was embarrassing to be removed from the school as well. It's definitely not a cool thing to be dragged out in front of all the girls and made to go and sit in the front by yourself. Nobody wants that. So I ended up making a circle for myself, very insular, very a lonely kid at school, and discouraged from spending time with the other kids who probably would have been able to help me and get me through that being able to communicate. And I genuinely believe, bit of a rant, that I was taken out of the room not because I was a distraction or my behaviour was bad, because I was quite quiet, but because I made the stats look bad. They didn't want my numbers associated with the school, and I suffered for that because I didn't have anyone to communicate with, ask questions. None of my peers were there to sort of support me and help me through any of the issues I had. It was me and there was one teacher. So that pyramid scheme was just two people, and there's no way I could have communicate with that person in a manner that would benefit me in learning. It wasn't an open discussion that I think would be perfect. If every child could have a one-on-one tuition and discuss things and be forced to think about things rather than just regurgitate and memorize information, that would be ideal. But that wasn't the case for me. It was still that they know everything and I knew nothing scenario. So close to that one-on-one tuition, being able to discuss things, but so far away, it was really, really bad. And when I'm getting a little bit more wise to what happened when I was a kid. Never really thought about it. I just finished school and got my apprenticeship. Now I'm taking kids out myself. I initially started teaching adults, but they're a nightmare. Kids are way more fun to teach. So now going out with kids and showing them, I'm consciously trying to get the best of both worlds. I'm constantly trying to have that circular sort of situation where everybody can talk to everyone and everyone can learn from everything else, but also be in a position to prompt and guide that structure so they are talking to the person next to them and not just constantly looking at the person that's at the front of the class or in the middle of the circle or walking around the outside of the circle because I'm trying to distance myself with it. It's a really difficult balance, and I hope I get to spend the rest of my life getting it right. But for now, what I find really interesting is when you sit in the circle as part of the group and openly admit that you don't know the answers. Okay, maybe you do know the answers, but openly admit, say, I don't know. And what you were saying about that bush earlier, that's the perfect example. Like 30 minutes to talk about one form or one subject and just encourage as many questions so they can come to their own conclusions is so rewarding. If somebody had done that with me when I was a kid, I'd have definitely got way more out of school, 100%. Sadly, that wasn't an option then, but hopefully it can be in the future. Hopefully we can work towards something that's more inclusive to everyone. Stop giving kids labels, because they don't really help, whatever that label may be.
I have a mistake which worked out really well. I had a child who was behaving really badly, and I hadn't been given information on this child. This was in the school's grounds, and he was quite disruptive, and he went up a tree. I'd kind of betrayed, there was a mistake of mine, I'd betrayed the trust of them coming out to learn in the wild by adding an element of writing. And I hadn't realised how hard that was for this child. And I lost him. And he was only really responding to men. So the teacher came out and asked him to come down out of the tree. And my boundaries were kind of trounced in the process. And the other children saw me not happy with the situation. The child got away with behaving horrendously and didn't really integrate back into the group. But he did. One of my assistants was wonderful, and she took him under her wing, and he did other things. But I wasn't happy with the situation. And after he went in, a little bunch of children stayed back and started helping me clear up, which was unusual unless I asked them. And they confided in me about the bullying that they'd been getting from this child. And it was because of my open vulnerability in the situation, the fact that I was willing to not be a success in the situation, to not hide my feelings or to try and style it out in any way, that they just talked to me, told me how they felt, and I got an awful lot of information that the school didn't know and were very glad to get. And the children got heard.
Yeah, it's really inspiring to hear all these stories. And I worked a lot with children in schools who were struggling with school. And when I set up this youth club, I was getting children coming to me saying, "Oh, Katie, I'm really depressed." And I'd be like, "Great, what are you depressed about?" And like, kind of being like, well done for being depressed, because actually your situation isn't that great. And you're actually, and that's the first stage of doing something about it. It was frustrating for me because a lot of the reasons why they were depressed was because of the school situation they were in, and literally because they were being labelled with X, Y, and Z. And I was like, well, but to acknowledge that actually that is a situation which can cause depression, anxiety, all the rest of it, was something to them that was like, oh, it's actually normal because this is an environmental circumstance which is causing this response inside of me, and it's not something that's intrinsically wrong with me. And I would go back to my supervisor and she'd say, oh, well, like depression's like a broken arm. And I'm like, no, it's not. Because you can't just fix a broken, it's a problem which is environmental, spiritual, to do with connection, to do with lack of intimacy, to do with so many things, which I think a fundamental shift in the foundations of our education system would have a massive impact on changing. And yeah, so an example of a story, like an inspiring story, is basically, for me, is just to not jump in as this teacher or this therapist or this counselor being like, oh, let me hear your problems and, you know, we'll talk through them and see what's wrong with you kind of thing. It's like what Thomas said at the very beginning. It's with his friend who he like went for a run with. It's like, oh, cool, let's just go and do something. And there's something really profound about that, because you're not sitting down regurgitating the same old problems and hence magnifying them. You know, if we're going to talk about quantum physics, which it's like, if you have a problem, don't keep talking about the problem. It doesn't work. And you have to find solutions and find connections and find things that are actually way more fun than that problem. And I mean, this is just one way of looking at it. But yeah, where I'm going with this is basically, yeah, that it's really important to have connections with people and working as a team week in, week out with the same teenagers. It was really profound, and it also broke boundaries, because we had to do these reports being like, did you talk about healthy eating? Did you talk about this? Did you talk about this? And it's like, actually, most of the time, just like when we're on a Project Wild School retreat, most of the time, like this conversation we're having, you keep going off topic, you keep talking about different things, and then you're like, oh yeah, that relates to that, and that relates to that. And it's the idea that within a education system which is in harmony with natural law and with nature, you have this, you basically have a not set disciplined structures. You're not carving nature at its joints. You're not cutting and defining and having concepts and going into an intellectual mind. You are actually fully relating with the whole of the thing itself, which to me is what the alpha or theta brainwave state would be as well, because you're no longer thinking and thinking itself is basically a way of carving up reality into bite-sized chunks that you can handle. And if you're in a theta state with nature, then you're not going to be, or an alpha state, then you're not going to be thinking in these ways. And this relates to diagnosis, because what is diagnosis? It's basically dividing people into different categories, dividing, just like the school subject system where you're dividing physics with biology, with religion. Well, we talked about all of those things and we haven't called it any of those things. And that to me is really important when we're talking about nature and education and educating children according to nature. I wanted to share one more story, and that is after I did my PhD, I basically had a bit of a crisis. Not a crisis, but just basically went to a meditation retreat center and woke up essentially. and I'd been foraging, and everything you were saying about connecting with nature and being equal with it, I was foraging in the woods, having just bunked a lecture about nature education, because I was like, this is so ironic. It's a sunny day, sorry, but I'm leaving. I left literally halfway through, and I basically went up to the woods and started foraging, and I was picking gorse flowers, and at that same time there was a deer, and also all the bees were also picking gorse flowers. And I tuned in to just being one with this bee. I was like, oh, I'm just another one of those things that picks this thing. And suddenly I was like, not really even a human anymore. I was just another thing that was eating. And like, that was really like another thing which at that time, like, just blew my mind. And basically, to cut a long story short, I basically sold all of my possessions and went to Israel, and then I went to the Amazon jungle in Peru, and really was engaging with a lot of what I felt about education and felt about needing to connect with nature and tuning into doing that for me as well. And one of the things that happened was one of a woman that had actually really inspired me, Francoise Friedman, who Thomas knows. She's an amazing anthropologist who works with child development, and she was one of the women that inspired me to go to the Amazon jungle. And whilst I was there, I stayed and chatted to some locals who lived in a mud, basically a shack over the river. This seems like this is going off topic, but basically this is something that's really affected my perception of the world, is that there was this mother and she had a 2-year-old baby, and the 2-year-old baby was playing with a litre of Coke, and what happened was the baby managed to open the bottle of Coke and spilt it all over the floor, basically. And if that had been, to be honest, if that had been in my own home, I would have been in serious trouble, probably even as a 2-year-old. The instinct reaction of a Westerner would be, oh my God, you've stained the carpet. That was a brand new carpet. Oh my God, this is such a disaster, and stressing out and putting stress into that situation. Whereas what happened in this Indigenous community was the mother and the father basically made sure very, very calmly that the baby was okay. And basically it was clear that there was no guilt put on that baby. And then only when they checked that the baby was okay and calm and felt nice, did they then pick up the bottle of the litre of Coke that was still pouring over the floor. And for me, I was thinking, wow, that's basically what putting humanity before consumerism is. That's basically what connection is with other human beings, and making sure that we're calm, that we're harmonious with the people that we care about. And that was just a game changer for me, because it made me see another game changer, but like during this whole process made me see that what we're really doing in the West. And Lainey actually showed me a book called The Continuum Concept. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, by Jean Laidlaw. And for me, going to the Amazon jungle was this experience of, when I was a child, I used to play in my back garden, and at the very back of the garden, it was really, really wild. And it was a kind of a secret place where I used to play, and there was like dandelions and grass which went basically as high as me, and just a place to really explore. And then I went through the education system. And by the way, I didn't finish the education system until I was 24, because I didn't leave. And it was only when I went to the Amazon jungle that I found that place at the end of my garden again. And actually was just like, this is what it is. This is actually just what it is. And for me, it's just so simple when it comes down to it. We've talked for 2 hours about basically just not thinking in nature. And it's just so simple. And us as a community of humans around the world need to realize and listen to the Indigenous people who have this knowledge that obviously we work as a team together. Obviously we do things which is in harmony with nature and with who we are. You've got in her book, you've got she didn't understand why the water wells were so far away. So what they did with this charity, they went in and they basically put the water wells close to the village. But then what happened was the people didn't care about time. They didn't care that it took ages to get their water, because they wanted to walk to get the water, and they wanted to have that community spirit of walking together to get the water, collect the water, come back. And I think that in Western education we have this real thing about efficiency. I'm ranting obviously, but we have this thing about efficiency, and nature's not really that efficient, and in not being efficient, it's the most efficient thing of all, because it goes at the pace that it needs to go at. And that's another thing which can't be defined. So I guess in all of this conversation that I'm saying, which feels like some sort of like mono speech, to myself in my room is basically that we have to be living in accordance with natural law. And this, what we're talking about, is actually more than education. It's basically about how us humans can do a better job of being humans. Yeah, and there's so much to be inspired by, and yeah, that's it really.
Can I just pick up on that last point you were saying about time? I think that the Western society's view of time, our sort of post-industrial socio-economic situation, says that time is money. And the ancient view of time is that your time is sacred to you. And that's much more where, you know, that the native people that you were talking about are existing in that relationship to time, where it's sacred time. And I think that if we start to, there are ways in which we can reorientate ourselves to time. You know, if we're paying attention to the seasons, because it's all there seasonally. The ancient calendar is there, both in the solar and the lunar cycles. And, you know, slowing down is one of the things that can help us to kind of drop back into that experience. The other point that I'd like to raise, which amused me greatly, is that I was, we're talking about how the children in our society are being given labels, and they're being given labels by a system that has a scientific validity. And yet, when we look at the origins of psychology, and maybe we look at Jung, for example, who was one of the first people to really put out some really useful and interesting concepts. And in his writing, he says that, in the book Memories, Dreams and Reflections, he says that some of his most important ideas came to him from his spirit guide Philemon. So we're looking at a shamanic, you know, psychology and psychiatry are aspects of a shamanic culture. And then what's happened in more recent times is with Stanislav Grof and Maslow, it's brought in a whole, you know, Maslow was looking at peak experience, and then Grof worked a lot with acid and, you know, LSD and how that changed our psychology and so on. And so we've got these very powerful shamanic aspects embedded in these cultural institutions. So, and you know, I was just looking at psychotherapy and thinking this just looks more and more like a sort of shamanic thing. And so I started to dig around, and those are some of the things that I discovered. And yet the simplicity of spending time in nature with other human beings, or maybe on our own, is something that has the capacity, a real powerful capacity for us to heal. And I'm going to end just with one story where I was running an introductory survival class, and one of the students, who was about 6'2" and 20 stone, he was a big guy, and he came to me at the beginning of the class and he said, "Look, you know, I'm not an idiot or anything." I'm having to change what he's actually said to me. "I'm not an idiot or anything, but don't get me up and ask me to do anything in front of the class." And so I took in what he was saying, and what I heard was, "I had a really bad experience at school, so please don't shame me in front of everybody else," which is what has been being spoken about in terms of how we're treating our young people. We're shaming them, you know, taking them out of the class, you know, and so on. These kind of mechanisms that just, or how we respond to what innocent young children do by spilling something when they're in the process of learning how things work. So I'm doing a bow drill fire lighting demonstration, and with this guy who's, you know, and the whole group's there, and I'm one breath away from the tinder bundle bursting into flames, and I go to this guy and I say, "I've run out of puff, can you blow on this?" And he just blows one breath onto the tinder bundle and it bursts into flames. And he says, "I did that." And it completely transformed that whole experience for him. And I wanted to test that later on, so I invited him to come and do something in front of the class. And he did it willingly and with a smile on his face. And he didn't just come to one class, he came back to another class. You know, after that, a more advanced class and so on. So I think that within these very simple ways of relating with each other and with nature, there's a great deal of healing, and it's just helping us to remember how to be human beings, really. You know, that's the main thing that we're working with.
This conversation has been so inspiring and is promoting how we can all help and support each other and connect back to our own nature. So thank you so much. I can't believe 2 hours have actually flown by already. I'd like to go around to each of our panelists, and I'll ask you to share any closing thoughts, and please do share your projects and websites too. I want to remind our audience you can find the links of our panelists and their bios on the show notes page at fortheloveoflearningshow.com, and do look for episode number 116. So let's start with you, Sue.
There's several things that we haven't touched on at all, and I'm loving what we have been talking about. But one of the things that I love about my work, having worked so long in nature conservation, I started to feel a bit of the burden of caring for nature, trying to protect resources that were disappearing. I spent a lot of time raising funds and putting people in contact with each other across wildlife areas, people who were working in isolation. And I did great work and I loved it. But there came a time where I felt it's quite hard to keep fighting. And going out into nature, you can just be. And one of the things that in nature conservation, obviously, is getting the next generation to want to care about nature, to love it, to want to protect it, to not want to harm it. And it's so great for people's mental health, as we've talked about, to go out to run in nature, to be in nature, to survive in style and the elements. And I think that it's fairly criminal to say to children, you are responsible for this planet, you must look after it, you must not harm it, and to make nature, that should be this great source of nurturing and escape from the rat race, a place to connect with yourself, to let the layers go. It should be just a source of love and support and strengthening, where you face the elements and you survive. And I like children to come out and people to come out into nature and experience just being in nature, loving nature, and then naturally from that they will want to care for nature. I think that if someone becomes a town planner and they've spent hours and hours, weeks and weeks playing in the woods, when they have a woodland in front of them that they could either protect or put houses on, they're going to want to keep that woodland there. Okay. And then my own project, Whittle and Spark, and the name is from exactly what we've been talking about. I wanted a name that reflected both the woodcraft skills, the being out in nature, so whittling with a knife, taking off little layers, and sparking a fire, and also the deep, deep nature of the work we do. So you allow yourself to let go the layers that you've put on to protect yourself in society and through upbringing, and you can just be yourself in a group of people and sparking that interest and that love of nature and interest in learning within individuals. So Whitland Sparks, my new baby of 4 years old, and we're taking children out into the woods to play, doing woodcraft activities and learning to make things and come out and play for adults as well. That's about it. Oh, and nature walks, nature safaris. I don't like to call them mini beast hunts particularly because I don't want to disturb every little creature we find. I want to go and look at them and get into that great brainwave state. Thank you.
So final thoughts from me are just actually firstly just how amazing this conversation has been and how many people are getting on board with different ways to relate with children and different ways to relate to themselves and different ways to relate with nature. And one of the things that's really come up as a theme for me within this conversation is we started off kind of with the general theme of teamwork, and it's ended up being a deeper conversation about the fact that we are teamwork with nature and that we're working as a team even if we're not with other humans, like and it gives the opportunity for when we're in a group with teenagers especially actually, but any children, is that when they're by themselves, that's not a problem, that's okay. If they want to go off and think about something or they want to go and do a project, it's like it's facilitating that as a possibility and giving them that connection with nature within the framework of the team as well. And it brings to mind, like I used to work as well for a residential charity in Dartmoor, and as part of this I lived in Dartmoor and I went for a walk and there were loads of cows and loads of sheep, and I was thinking, they're not even talking to each other. Like, how did they, I mean, they are, but they're not speaking loads and being really noisy. And I don't know, that brings up another question into itself, but it is to do with how humans speak so much and have so many intellectual conversations. And I think part of this is to do with our education system intellectualizing people. And another thing that we've been touching upon a lot in this conversation is stuff that goes beyond the realm of thought. So we're connecting with the team. Say we're doing a survival endurance race, or we're in the forest with forest school kids, or we're doing shamanic work with a group of adults in the woods. Say we're doing any of those things, we can actually do so without talking so much if we get into a certain way of being, into this alpha brainwave state. And I think all of us can really connect with the idea that once we've established the rules, because there are always rules, once we've established the roles and the rules of the group, we can then operate without actually needing to intellectualize or talk. We can operate from the heart. We can operate from basically our physicality, and I think that in itself is a key factor to intimacy within a group. And getting on with each other and really actually knowing each other. It means that you're basically reading each other's minds. And I think we've all experienced that with facilitating groups. Just tuning in with each other and then also tuning in with nature, because that's the state that we're in. And that's something that I think is really important within education, because it means that we're no longer basically prescribing intellectual academia as the only way we can be and exist as humans. So yeah, that's something that I find really interesting about the conversation that's unfolded. And what I'm up to is I am writing a book for Project Wild School, talking about my experiences in all the different types of, pretty much, if you've got a different education system that I haven't heard of, tell me, but I've pretty much been a teaching assistant or something or other within most types of education now. And I feel like I'm basically writing a book about all the different spectrums of education that I've experienced, and relating that to my experiences with Project World School, which to me is the best model that I've come across out of all of the ones. And I'm really passionate about it, and I'm passionate about basically stopping children suffering, because on a deep level, that's what it is actually about. It's about, I don't want to get too, like, actually no, it is, I basically want to stop child abuse, because that is actually what's happening in our schools to so many children. And yeah, that's something that I just think needs to stop. And I hope that we look back in 50 years' time and say, well, that was pretty much child abuse because we weren't respecting those children and what their needs were and what they wanted. And that's like a really deep one for me, because it's like, I think it's really important, obviously. So that's what I'm up to. I'm writing a book about all those things which I'm passionate about. And I'm also going to be hopefully, well, I am continuing to go on Project World School retreats. We're going to Thailand in actually just a few weeks, it turns out. It's come up so much quicker than I thought. So check out the projectworldschool.com website for all the retreats that are coming up, and talk to me about things if you've got children. If you're listening to this, if you've got children, I'm so open to talking to you about any of these issues that you might have, or any queries or concerns. Just Facebook me or email me, and I'll be so happy to talk to you.
Final thought from me on teamwork and nature as a tool to educate people. I was 27 years old before I even heard the word reciprocity, and I think that's a crime. I think that is something that should be taught to everyone that is at school, just as much as filling in a tax return or learning to cook yourself a meal. It's one of those things that's overlooked, and getting rid of what we talked about earlier, that teacher in that central role. If we can break that down, then we're definitely a massive step towards getting Katie what she wants, and teaching kids how to communicate. It's just got to be done. What am I up to? Well, yeah, nature and team building is what I do at Roots. Take groups of people and give them a challenge to complete as a team, and give them a time hack for them to solve that problem together. It's really interesting to watch how the dynamic of a group in a natural environment changes between different backgrounds and different professions that are involved in the group. Our next event, we have a survival race in Dartmoor, which will be an ultra marathon, and each checkpoint will be a survival task for them to complete. So again, another opportunity for adults to learn things in nature that you never taught, to learn something new, right? So that's the plan. And just a huge thank you for inviting me on. It's been so cool to listen to everybody talk. I've learned so much, and it's reignited passion that is there. It's just now bigger. We'll go away and do lots more with a bigger smile on my face. So thanks very much.
So I'd like to echo those thanks. It's been really inspiring hearing everyone else, and you know, how delightful to be able to join in this sort of a conversation. My favourite kind of conversation, really, and especially hearing other people's stories and insights. I'd like to share one last story, which is about sort of nature awareness training, really. And it's a story from my teacher. He'd been invited to go and run a class away from where he teaches in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. And he was sitting in the airport lounge with the student who'd invited him there. And they're waiting for the plane to be called. And he says to the student, "Oh, can you hear that?" And the student sort of says, "What?" He says, "Oh, just listen." And the student starts to listen, and after a little while he starts to hear this cricket chirping in the airport lounge. And the student looks at Tom and says, you know, smiles, and Tom says, "Where's it coming from?" And the student gets up and he starts to wander off into the airport lounge, and he finds this planter where there are a couple of crickets chirping, and then suddenly hears some other crickets chirping in another planter, and he comes back and, you know, all he can hear are these crickets chirping in the airport lounge. And Tom says, hang on a minute, and he takes a small coin out of his pocket and he throws it on the ground. And about 20 people turn round because they've heard that sound. And that's one of the things that we can do as teachers in the circle, is we can say, oh, listen, can you hear that? And we just bring people's attention and awareness to things that are outside of their range and ask them the right question so that they can discover those things for themselves. And I told this story once. I was teaching a schools group, and I told that story, and there's a particular point in the year when the first cricket chirps. And just as I finished telling that story, the first cricket of the year chirped. And I heard it. And I don't know if any of the other students heard it or not. I didn't say anything. But for me, that was just, that's the way in which nature can communicate back with us sometimes. You know, that some aspect of nature just acknowledges what we've just shared. The things that I'm up to, I'm just about to start a new year-long course where I teach people physical survival skills, nature connection skills, and some of the shamanic skills. And it's run over the length of about 10 months with about 7 meetings over that time. And my website is trackways.co.uk, or, you know, 3 W's and trackways.co.uk. And I also have a couple of online courses as well. If you don't have time to come and do a class, or you're far away, then a lot of the basic survival information is available on Udemy. And again, those links are on my website. And for the last 8 years, I've been writing a book, and I'm nearly finished with that, which is trying to bring together all of the sorts of things that I've been talking about and offer them in a way that hopefully will affect the whole industry positively and integrate not just the physical aspects, but these energetic and sort of more spiritual aspects. Though, you know, calling things spiritual always seems a bit strange to me. It's all one, really. Anyway, it's been a real delight, you know, and thanks for inviting me on. And it was lovely to meet all of you in this way, and I hope to, you know, have more conversations with you guys at some other point.
Thank you again to each of our panelists. Thank you to Katie, who was one of tonight's guests, but this actually was her first show producing as well. She has joined the For the Love of Learning Voices of the Alternative Education Movement team, and we are so happy and honored to have her. She will be producing and even doing a little guest hosting from time to time, so be sure to watch out for more from Katie in the near future. Thank you as well to Mel and Biggie over at Conscious Consumer Network. We remain grateful for the work that you do and grateful for having this platform to broadcast these shows on. Thank you to you, our audience. We are so honored you've spent your evening with us, and we urge you to watch and share all of our shows in our archives. We've created a vast library of conversations surrounding all things alternative education. Our vision is to put these empowering conversations into the world as a resource for anyone seeking alternatives to the conventional route. Please share and watch and let us know what you'd like to see more of in the future from us. Finally, wherever you are and whatever you do, continue to always do it for the love.
If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire, the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.